It is such a pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the monograph, Through the Threads, a publication that delves deeply into Synnøve Anker Aurdal's long and extraordinary artistic practice. My name is Solveig Øvstebø, and I am the director here at the Museet. And I had the great privilege of curating the survey exhibition of Synnøve Anker Aurdal's work held at the museum in 2022. I hope many of you got to see it. The publication that we are launching tonight, and which is co-edited with my esteemed colleague Lars Bang Larsen, is in part a printed sequel to this exhibition. Textile art might not be what the Astrup Fearnley collection is most known for, but when I started as director in 2020, I was pleasantly surprised to discover that Synnøve Anker Aurdal holds a special place in the museum's history. The museum's founder, Hans Rasmus Astrup, began collecting Anker Aurdal's tapestries in the early 1960s. Over the decades, he acquired some of her major works, which were presented in the 2022 exhibition alongside key pieces from other Norwegian collections. Many of these works had rarely or never been exhibited publicly. Together, they showcased a breadth of Anker Aurdal's production spanning the 1940s to the 1990s and highlighted a lifelong practice that remains powerful and relevant today. Synnøve Anker Aurdal, she grew up in Lillehammer and was inspired early on by the cultural environment around Maihaugen. Here she gained knowledge and understanding of traditional craft and the techniques that connected, that she carried into her education and artistic practice. I could not have become an artist in any other way than through the threads, Anker Aurdal once said in an interview. And here you get where we got the title from of this book. Her works demonstrate how masterfully she experienced with exactly that, the thread, creating a unique artistic expression. Anker Aurdal challenged tradition by merging craft techniques with the language of painterly abstraction. She redefined tapestry making and created new space for modern textile arts. Her use of unconventional materials, such as copper thread, polyester, fiberglass, nylon, and metal chain, gave her works a distinct character. Materiality often became a subject in itself, as she continuously pushed the boundaries of what tapestry could be and what stories it could tell. She also paved the way for recognizing textiles and tapestries as independent artistic expressions. While her formal focus is evident, Anker Aurdal was also an astute social commentator. Through motifs and textual references, she often addressed the pressing issues of her time with satirical humor and political critique. This is particularly apparent in works like Bureaucrats and Women's Front, the latter also reflecting her feminist engagement. The exhibition and this book were inspired by the enduring power that flows through the threads of Anker Aurdal's works. During the project, it became clear that a comprehensive monograph on her 6-decade career was due, and Through the Threads writes a new chapter on the oeuvre of this pioneering artist. This project has been years in the making, and many deserve our thanks. First, I am deeply grateful to Lars Bang Larsen for his insight and thoughtful perspectives, both through his essay contribution and also his role in conceptualizing the book. I also wish to thank Hjørdis Dambolt for her critical research in her 1991 book, Dikt selv. My heartfelt thanks goes to Torstein Tvenge, as well as the Norwegian Arts Council for their generous support to the book. and to Eline Mugås for her invaluable help allocating the work, both for the show, but also photographs for the books. I am so grateful to my colleagues at the Effervescent for the dedication to this project over so many years. Thank you for your patience and hard work. And especially, I would like to give a big thanks to the in-house designers, Sandra Stokka and Johannes Barle Bjellum, for their beautiful, beautiful design. On behalf of the Effervescent, I want to thank everyone who lent their works for the exhibition, and to Galleri Ris for their vital assistance. And of course, the book would not be what it is without the amazing contributions of the writers Marit Paasche, Jennifer Sorkin, and Leire Vergagra, who have opened new avenues for engaging with Anker Aurdal's art. Additionally, like a book inside the book, we have republished the poems we commissioned for a small publication that we did in connection with the 2022 exhibition that we called Poems for Synnøve, which emphasized Synnøve Anker Aurdal's strong affinity to poetry. So a warm thank you to the poets, Priya Bain, Fredrik Hagen, Morten Langeland, Erlend O. Nødtvedt, Caroline Brennjord, Vilde Heggen, Maiken Hån Bolseth, or Jonathan August Lengali for their beautiful contributions. You will find them in the middle of in the book. They are there, they're reprinted there. And finally, I wish to extend a special and warm thanks to Siri Aurdal, Synnøve's daughter, for her time with me over all these years, the conversations we've had, and the glimpses into memories which have allowed us all to better understand both the person and the artist, Synnøve Anker Aurdal. So, turning to tonight's event, we are so honored and thrilled to welcome Lynne Cooke. It has long been a wish of mine to invite Lynne to Oslo. And this event provides the perfect occasion, I think. Lynne Cooke is a senior curator in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. She has served as deputy director and chief curator at the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofía in Madrid, curator of the Dia Art Foundation in New York, and artistic director of the 10th Biennial of Sydney. Lynne is also curator of the brilliant, ongoing touring exhibition, Woven History, Textiles and Modern Abstraction, and editor of the rigorous exhibition catalog with the same name. The show will be on view at MoMA New York in 2025, so go and see that. We have invited Lynne to give a talk looking at contributions of weaving and related techniques to modern abstraction. Based on her long-standing research across artistic media, Lynne will contextualize Anker Aurdal's tapestries with the work of key modern and contemporary textile artists such as Annie Albers, Lenore Tawney, and Sheila Hicks. After this presentation, we invite one of our amazing contributors, Marit Paasche, to join Lynne in a conversation with Lars Bang Larsen here at the podium. And Marit is an independent curator, art historian, and writer. She's the author of, among other books, Hanna Ryggen, Threads of Defiance from 2019, and she has also edited numerous books and written extensively on contemporary art. But first, thank you all for being here. Welcome to the speakers, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to Lynne Cooke.
Thank you very much, Solveig, for that very warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and very exciting for me because I did not know the work of Synnøve Anker Aurdal until about 4 years ago when Solveig introduced it to me. At that stage, I think we were in a pandemic, and I certainly didn't see anything. I found it very interesting. At that stage, had I had the possibility of seeing work and knowing more, I would have, in retrospect I can say this, I would have tried to get the work into the exhibition I was organizing, but it was too late, and by the time the pandemic was done and travel was possible, it was out of the question. And so it's only today that I've actually seen several works in person and also seen the book, which is remarkable. And I feel there's an astonishing artist that I only wish I had known more about sooner. But nonetheless, it's fantastic to be aware of this work. And so tonight, I want to talk about some of the artists, textile makers, who are working in parallel. By that, I'm going to say working in the 60s and 70s, more or less. But I will make some references to artists working today, who are much younger, and several others, just to point to commonalities, I think, which have to do with being part of self-conscious avant-garde, in which textile is a medium, a material, a technology within an art practice that is a contemporary art practice, and very different from what in the US, we would have called studio crafts, studio textiles in the 50s and 60s. And this change has happened over the last 50 years, and it's been of enormous importance in recognizing the role that textiles have had in shaping narratives of modernist art for the last 100 years. But to begin with, and I will do this within the context of showing you sections of the exhibition, Woven Histories, that Solveig mentioned. So I want to start with the work by two artists, Igshan Adams and Diedrich Brackens, who are in this exhibition. They are the youngest artists. They're both in their 30s. And they both make textiles as part of multimedia practices as contemporary artists. And both of them, Igshan Adams was born in a coloured township outside Cape Town in South Africa. He identifies as a queer artist and he identifies as a Muslim. Diedrich Brackens was born in the US in the South. And currently lives and works in Los Angeles. He is an African-American artist whose family members, like Igshan Adams' family members, women in the family, made textiles. They were sewed. So both artists grew up within that environment. Both of them turned to textiles and weaving in particular only when they went to graduate art school. Not before, and hadn't seen it. They both started as students in painting and quickly turned to textile as their preferred medium. But what makes them very particularly contemporary, I'd say, is that they're weavers. And this separates what I see as an efflorescence in contemporary art practice that uses textiles today from what you might see as an efflorescence in the 70s when, fueled by feminism, much work that involved textiles that was being made by women or had been made in the past by women was brought to the fore. But those practices were essentially needle practices, sewing and quilting. Those artists, textile makers, worked in domestic situations, and they did not necessarily identify as artists. They may have seen themselves as craftswomen working at home. And so these are really key points of differentiation between those two moments, more or less today, 50 years apart. And just before moving on, I would add that it was work like these, work by these artists that really generated this exhibition. It was out of this efflorescence in the present that I started looking back and trying to construct a history of previous moments across the 20th century. The final thing to say about the two works that you're looking at, both I said as weavings, both might be called wall hangings. The Brackens is based on a piece of worn-out linoleum flooring that he salvaged from his neighbor's house outside Cape Town, where he grew up, and he used it as a template. It's 1-to-1 scale, and wove the pattern. Of course, the pattern on this cheap linoleum goes back, as does the final wall hanging, to the great Islamic rug traditions of the 15th and 16th century. So he is calling out his ancestry in doing this, and at the same time, the materials he uses are commonplace and not expensive, unlike the materials in those rugs, and they include plastic beads and false crystals and telephone cord and so forth. But what he's done is, in the areas of the textile of the linoleum that was worn out, where there are holes, he's repaired it with this gold thread, and not gold thread in the sense of the 17th century, which was real gold, but with a gold-colored thread. So you see this item that has been transformed from something that speaks to his childhood memory and his diasporic cultural traditions into a work that's celebratory and reparative. In some ways, the Diedrich Bracken's is similar. It's made up of narrow strips of woven wool, cotton, and cotton, of course, has a particular resonance for African Americans, many of whom in earlier centuries were enslaved persons who were forced to work under oppressive conditions, collecting cotton from fields. So there's that reference, but there's also, in these narrow strips that have been woven and then stitched together with these brightly colored rectangles on them, you see reference to kente cloth, which is the most revered of all the textiles made in sub-Saharan Africa in the past. And I point out that I think there's something very parallel going on in this work, which also in its strips that hang and then get stitched together, and in the patterning that has these bright jabs of color within the darker, more the copper and the deep burgundy. There's, in my mind, I think probably a reference to kente cloth. And the Brackens has one other key reference, and that is to quilt making, and particularly to the very famous and important African-American quilts made at Gee's Bend. So again, you see this process of bringing different strands together that reference parts of Bracken's history to define, to constitute a subject position. So their work comes at the end of the exhibition. The exhibition begins with a group of women artists in the post-World War I era who turned to textiles. But most relevant to contextualizing the work of Anker Aurdal is to look at the generation who were essentially her generation. And what you're looking at is one gallery in the exhibition that includes work by Annie Albers on your left, and Lenore Tawney, and Lillian Elliott, and Ed Rosbach, three American weavers on the right-hand side. And I will talk about the preoccupations of those artists so you can see how a context of relation and dialogues could be made with Anker Aurdal's work. So what we're looking at here is work that Annie Albers made after she fled Germany in 1933 with the rise of the Nazis, and began teaching at Black Mountain College in North Carolina. She stewarded the legacy of the Bauhaus, where she was one of the two principals in the weaving workshop. But even as she did this, she began to modify her practice. And what she started to do, and which was very formative for subsequent generations, was to look at the fundamentals of weaving, rather than to broaden the basis of weaving, to hone in on what made it essential. And for her, the first thing that makes a weave is a thread. And you see these two drawings here. I think I've got you see a detail here in which she's taken a thread and she's let it interlace and then not. So if you're going to make a fabric, very first fabrics, if you think back in human history, would be made from taking a piece of grass or taking a strand of something and making a knot and making another knot. And soon you have a net or a proto-basket in which you can carry something. And it's argued by paleoarchaeologists that the first forms of material culture, none of which of course survived given the ephemerality of the materials, were in fact forms of netting and basketry. So this is the way in which Albers starts to regenerate her practice by looking at thread. And Sheila Hicks, in turn, does essentially the same thing 15 years later, where she takes bundles of threads, woolen dark green thread as you see here, and holds them together by wrapping silk thread around them, brightly colored, or by braiding, as you see here too, to make one long linear structure. And again, it's this linear form that will be the basis of her work for the rest of, she's still working today, 50-something years later. And this work, as I said, comes out of work made in the beginning of the 20th century by the historic avant-gardes. And what you see here is an Annie Albers, the big wall hanging, and other Bauhaus-related work to the right. And you see that it's very different. It's a geometric abstraction, but it's made as a kind of checkerboards and lines, but not a focus on the linear. And here's another work made from the Bauhaus weaving workshop. So this is Albers' second phase of her career, if you like. And from those drawings of thread, she then makes this extraordinary weaving, the big red one, in which lines are set into a red twill ground in a way that's rhythmic, but there is no geometric structure. There is no geometric plotting, and there are no drawings that precede this. She has made it on the loom as she's gone along. And it has that kind of rhythmic syncopation that you'd find perhaps in certain works by Piet Mondrian. So the reference to painting is important. These are painting adjacent works in Albers' terms. And then on the right, you see a late Albers, in fact, the last weaving she made before she stopped in 68 for reasons because she couldn't physically manipulate the loom. And you can see that line is again the key formal component that is making up the composition against this gold ground. And this line is a form of calligraphy or writing. And of course, in English, text and textile come from the same Latin root. So those references to text are very important. And now you see another work by Sheila Hicks, the white one with these threads hanging down, very similar to the kinds of braided thread that I showed you in the green work, and I would argue quite similar to the braided forms that we're looking at here. This is made decades later, but it's made of thinking about fundaments in the art form. And these are braided in part and made into thin strips, which is exactly what Hicks is doing on this work with the white rectangular top, which she calls kipu. And of course, the reference is to pre-Columbian textiles, which for Annie Albers and the generation of Hicks and many others are the greatest textiles ever made. That the pre-Columbian textile makers were more innovative, more radical, more inventive in the vast range of different stitches and weaves that they worked out than any other known group of weavers. And I think you see here that maybe there's a reference to kipu, which is like a long cord which has knotted and braided strings hanging from it, which was used by pre-Columbian cultures to measure and make accounting and note-taking. And then on the other side of the same gallery, you see works by Lenore Tawney, which is the black one, called Vespers on the right. Sorry, it's not very clear. It's a very vibrant work by Olga de Amaral, who was born in Colombia, in Bogota, where she has spent most of her life working, but she was trained in the US, in Cranbrook, where Lillian Elliott, whose work is on this side, was also studying. And it's one of the most famous schools in the US for studying weaving. And again, you see at that moment how important line and thread were to these artists investigating the foundations of their art forms. And the different colored threads or threads, braided forms there that make up this very kind of irregular, unstructured composition have, again, great affinities here. And for Olga de Amaral, she's also making long strips, which she then weaves together and cross-weaves as a way to make a composition. You see the Amaral again, perhaps a little more clearly. And in the center, you see Tawney's Vespers. And this is a work that's like a casement, like a very open form weaving of the kind in furnishings you might put in front of a window that partly obscures but still lets in light. It's very common in textiles today. But you can see that she's opened it up so that the warps, the vertical threads, are exposed, and it makes this kind of linear tracery that has a kind of like Gothic architecture reference, I think. It's not surprising, perhaps, that she's titled it with reference to Vespers, which is part of the service in the Anglican Church. And to the left, there's a small painting by Agnes Martin, and a textile by Rosemary Trockle. And on the right, that crisscross form is a drawing on grid paper by Lenore Tawney, and she's been looking at a jacquard loom where the threads are all up high and they come down, they spin very fast. And that has provided the source for that work. But what I want to focus on is this comparison between Agnes Martin and Lenore Tawney, who were both, as emerging artists, living in downtown New York in the late 50s and early 60s. They both had studios there. They were very, very close friends. And there's a back and forth of influence and inspiration and shared concerns between them. And what you see in the Agnes Martin, which is made right at a moment of transition in her work from a kind of biomorphic abstraction that's landscape-based to a much more radical, non-referential abstraction, is she's made a work which looks like a textile. In other words, these are like the exposed warps that I pointed to in this, like the lines, they're black lines, white lines that look like threads, which are being held in place by a border, which is an interlace, a woven border. So you could see it almost as a painting that emulates a weaving. She's made it 1 year before the Tawney, which is one of her first great works, and you can see how the back and forth must have gone on in their conversations and visiting each other's studios. The thing is that both of them quickly became celebrated. They would never have been exhibited together. Works by Tawney circulated in the textiles and crafts world, in the museums devoted to that, the discourse, the criticism, and the collecting of it all took place within the realm of the applied or decorative arts textile world. And the Agnes Martin was one of the leading artists, leading abstract artists, the leading American artists, really by the early 60s. She was highly acclaimed. The fact that this had gone on was irrelevant. Nothing they did would have ever changed that firewall. It was really very rigidly reinforced. And the artists who supported Martin would have been, the critics would have been appalled to have this reference pulled out, because it could be said to have undermined her work, suggesting it was crafty, and that it referred to women's work, and of course domestic works like sewing and quilting was seen as women's work and therefore lesser. As I said earlier, that is not the situation today. And what I show you here is a work by Rosemary Truckle, for whom Agnes Martin has been an enormous mentor figure, a key figure. Not that their work usually looks alike, but for Truckle, she is absolutely up there in her pantheon. And the work is a direct reference, an homage to the Agnes Martin, and it's made by taking strands of wool and pulling them across the canvas and stapling them. In other words, it really performs a series of artistic gestures that are very, very like that little Martin I showed you from 1960, and many other Martins in part. And so again, Rosemary Truckle is a leading artist working today. She is a contemporary artist. She is not a textile artist. She's never been a textile artist, but textiles are at the center of her practice. And I think this juxtaposition is there to kind of suggest some of that. So I'll end by just looking at one other gallery where you see a second formal component, not the line-thread relationship, but the grid. The grid, of course, is fundamental to any basic weave, over and under, the warps and the wefts going like this, that makes the structure of cloth. The grid in the thinking of modernists, modern artists, and in the theorizing of that, is centered around the grid as an organizing structure. And so what you have here is later Agnes Martin, which is seen as the locus classicus of abstraction in the later 20th century, set beside an Olga de Amaral, which is the big blue work, which is made of weavings of weavings. And on the back wall, you have three artists working in the 21st century who are taking this relationship between painting and textile one stage further. And what you're looking at are works by Marilou Schultz, who's a Navajo artist, a textile weaver, Analia Saban in the middle, and Jack Whitten, a painting, another Analia Saban. And there's, in my mind, an argument to be made for a resurgence in abstraction in the art of the last 20 years that's generated in response to and by reference to the digital world. And of course, if you know the basics of a computer, the computer comes out of the, is indebted to the punch card system of the jacquard loom. So there's that kind of fundamental meshing. But both the Marilou Schultz and the Analia Saban and the Whitten painting all are based on digital hardware. Computer chips in those two, and an ER stamp, which is like a QR code, in the third. So you see the structure and form of abstraction made by contemporary artists. Again, there's a parallel between those working with textile and those in paint, but you see the relationship between textile and painting abstraction as utterly fundamental. And the Saban, which takes a chip which was a key chip in the generation of video technology, also references the great textiles, the tapestries. Of course, and it's made on a jacquard loom, which is a way of making a tapestry-like composition, and uses copper, which is a central material in the computer chip, but also like the gold thread in tapestries. So I'll stop there because, of course, there's copper there again, and it's been one of the preferred materials for a variety of different reasons in the last several decades. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Lynne, for an extremely stimulating talk on woven histories that looks absolutely fabulous. So I'm Lars Bang Larsen, and I have some questions for Marit, who penned such a great essay for our book on Anker Aurdal's work, and I'll have some questions for Lynne too, and then we'll open up to questions from the floor as well. But first I'll take 5 minutes to briefly situate the work of Anker Aurdal. So as Solveig mentioned, it's been my pleasure and my privilege to work on Through the Threads with her and with the Astrid Fearnley Museum. Anker Aurdal's work is both stunning and under-theorized, and in general, the Norwegian history of modern textile art is exceptional. For one thing, it certainly differs from my corner of Scandinavia. I can't think of a Danish textile artist who was part of modern art and public life in the way that Anker Aurdal was. I speak as an art historian who has come to textile art from what is called contemporary art. And I'm saying this because, as Lynne also noted in her talk, there were, and in some ways there still are, a separation and a hierarchy between textile art on the one hand and modern and contemporary art on the other. A separation that has turned textiles and textile art into an ambiguous and unresolved presence in the art field. What are textiles and textile art aesthetically? Where do they belong institutionally, etc.? So in the history of modern Western art, weaving was not necessarily considered a proper artistic medium. So for an art historian of my generation to engage with textile art, when I started doing so some years ago, was a bit like learning another language or discovering a parallel universe. Textile art was... Tak skal du have. Sorry. Textile art was placed in this parallel universe by the likes of the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who in 1790 made a firm distinction between art and handicraft. So Kant writes, quote, "Art is called free, handicraft may be called industrial art," unquote. So as clear as that. This statement also says something about who can make art, because by definition, the free artist can only be a free subject. And in 1790, this would be European self-owning man. So gender is implied here, and class and race as well. About handicraft, Kant says that it's labor, and labor, according to Kant, is only attractive by means of what it results in. For instance, the pay, unquote. So, you only work to get paid. And handicraft is labor, and that's bad enough in the context of art. But on top of this, textile making is the kind of labor that was often women's unpaid housework, a form of reproductive labor, in other words. So in this way, Kant in Western philosophy prepared a sort of aesthetic terminus, a sort of final stop for textile art by associating it with gendered subjectivity and gendered labor. And this was still what Aurdal and other women textile artists in the 20th century were up against. The freedom that they claimed through textile art was, in several respects, I think, a compromised kind of freedom. But there were also other modern voices on craft and textiles than Kant, fortunately. So, in the middle of the 19th century, the German architect and art historian Gottfried Semper claimed that the beginning of building coincides with the beginning of textiles. And that's because, Semper writes, that the first spatial divider, the first human-made wall, was not built with stone, but woven with blades of grass or plant fibers, he says. So according to Semper, weaving was nothing less than the creation of the idea of space, he says. So Semper called weaving an Urtechnik in German, so a primal technique, apropos of what Lynne says about paleoarchaeology. So there's some paleoarchaeological speculation going on there in Gottfried Semper. And here we can, of course, think of how Anker Aurdal made a name for herself by making big commissions for buildings all over Norway. However, and to make a long story short, Gottfried Semper ended up distinguishing weaving from what he called architecture's true form, that he affirmed to be monumental and permanent. So even if architecture began as weaving, according to Semper, he ends up saying that also architecture is something that's made by men and not woven by women. Semper was fascinated by weaving and textiles, though, and he didn't quite know where to place them as an art form. As if in a nod to Kant's devaluation of craft, Semper writes that the goddesses of beauty, the Graces, have abandoned weaving, and they have done so for a quite specific reason. Semper writes, quote, "Weaving is forsaken by the Graces and drowning, as it were, in its own excessive resources," unquote. Weaving is drowning in its own excessive resources. I mean, what a statement, 1863. Here Semper claims that weaving is just too resourceful, too rich for its own good. It can be and do anything. And that's why it's neither art nor architecture, which is a strange sort of argument. But I think Semper's characterization of the riches of weaving is pretty great. And it's so aligned with Anker Aurdal's tapestry making as an art of joy and excess and exuberance. Because in her hands, weaving was too much in a wonderful way. In the way that she created tapestries with vivid synthetic colors that still jump out at you. How she famously worked with metal beads and other seductive tricks and materials alien to textile art. And in a word, she was into bling, and her tapestries were like a carnival at Maihaugen. She leapt between themes and styles and expressions too. This to the extent that an excited Danish art critic in 1976 described her work as both fish and fowl. Not neither fish nor fowl, as the saying goes, but both fish and fowl, surprisingly and convincingly at the same time. Annie Albers, who Lynne referred to in her talk, famously talked about the event of the thread in weaving. That is, the thread as tapestry's always present and active basic element. And I think it's safe to say that Anker Aurdal's thread was always a very eventful one. Her tapestries really are carpet to make you fly. Yeah, on that note, can I invite the two of you to the podium? Yeah, Marit, yep. Let's begin with you.
Yeah.
In your essay, you write, in your essay for our book, you write about Anker Aurdal as a maker of public art.
Yeah.
And you focus on works that are still on display in the spaces for which they were created. And that's three works you home in on. It's Højsætetippet, the throne tapestry at Håkonshallen in Bergen. Then it's Composition from 1965 at Asker Municipality. And it's Rummet og Ordene, which is a title that sounds much better in Norwegian.
Yeah.
Space and Words from 1977 at the National Library in Reykjavik. So all three of them are still there. And you are the authority on the also phenomenal work of Hanne Røggen. So I wonder, could you say something about how textile artists like Hanne Røggen and Anker Aurdal worked with public commissions, and specifically how they filled the role previously held by the monumental painters in Norway?
Yeah. In the Norwegian art history, there was a kind of significant shift, I would say, during the mid-20th century, where textile art gained prominence in public spaces and also large-scale buildings. And that was areas that had traditionally been dominated by monumental painting. And you can just think of Edvard Munch's Aula paintings, for instance, or the frescoes here at the City Council of Oslo. And together with Hanna Ryggen, I think also Synnøve Anker Aurdal was one of the most influential figures in this tradition, and she revolutionized textile art by transforming it into a kind of modern, semi-abstract artistic expression. And I think throughout her career she was making textile for public commissions. Yeah, and that's really amazing to see how many there are in public spaces.
Yeah, still to this day, and this was her thing, or one of her things.
Yeah,
actually,
it was.
But what did this shift from monumental painting to tapestries? What did it reflect? Would you say?
Yeah, I think it reflected. Well, in Norway, tapestry became seen more as a contemporary medium that could connect both to our very rich textile heritage, while also expressing more modern ideas, modern artistic ideas. And you mentioned Semperer, but around this started around the end of the 1950s. And in 1960, we had this French architect called Le Corbusier, who coined tapestries as portable murals. And his point was that they were efficient, they were functional, and they were far more flexible than murals or modern paintings. So tapestries could provide kind of warmth, they could also provide acoustic benefits in a modernist architecture that was often kind of stark. But maybe I would say the most interesting aspect is that the women artists were given an opportunity to express themselves in big formats, and also to be available and be seen in public space.
Yeah. Before I have a question for the both of you, just one more question for you, Marit. Because in your text, you emphasize, this is apropos of something you said as well. You said that in the 1970s, feminist textile artists or feminist textile makers didn't necessarily identify as artists. Was that right? But they were also into claiming a space for craft.
Yes.
Yes. So there we have the art-craft conflict again from another angle, though. But in your text, Marit, you emphasized that Anker Aurdal insisted on being an author.
Yeah.
So an artist and not an artisan.
Yeah.
So unlike feminists in the 70s, she was very much into claiming and acquiring authorship.
Yeah.
And that also has quite a bit to do with the fact that she worked at an earlier point, at a time when her weaving was not necessarily seen as art, and when the role of the artist was largely a male privilege, obviously. And you suggest that Anker Aurdal's feminism can be approached through what you call a feminist impatience that still resonates through the decades. So feminist impatience, can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, I like this expression. Like the American art historian Julia Bryan Wilson, I'm quite skeptical towards the kind of craftivism that emerged after the turn of the millennium, in which all textile art has been ascribed a political or feminist intent. I think it is maybe also, but there are different ways of considering the political. And while Anker Aurdal only made one explicitly feminist tapestry over the course of her career, and I think you mentioned it, Solveig, the Women's Front, Kvinnefronten, from 1983. Looking at the totality of her work led me to think of the expression feminist impatience that was coined by the literature professor, English one, called Barbara Hardy. And feminist impatience describes how all small and silent gestures and actions throughout the life together can create a rebellion story of a more unassuming sort. And I think if one considers Anker Aurdal's artistic practice along with all the minor and major choices that went into it, I believe the term is quite accurate and also appropriate. Yeah.
Thanks. What do the two of you think is the most dominant feature in Anker Aurdal's work? I mean, what stands out to you when you look at these works? I mean, the works that are in this space, or you think of other works by her? I mean, I know that you are very recently introduced to her work and have only seen it in the flesh or in the thread only today, but I don't know, Marit, maybe you would like to start.
Yeah, I think...
Or just a favorite work, maybe.
Maybe a favorite work. I don't think I have a favorite work, but I think overall she was very playful. And I think, yeah, she drew heavily upon both folk art and modern painting. And I also think of her a bit like a magpie. I think she was stealing a lot, which is perfectly fine to do if you're an artist and if you do it with bravery. And I think she did that. And she experimented widely with materials, as you mentioned. But I would say the most dominant feature in her artistic output maybe is the way she abstracted nature and impressions from nature. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. I think in our preface to the book, we talk about, we ask her rhetorically the question of how did she get away with it? So, yeah. And I think actually that's something that comes back to a conversation that we had. Speaking of stealing, it may be something that you said actually.
Yeah.
I mean, how this, how she claimed a space for herself in spite of all. How could she get away with it? I think that's also part of the. I mean, as she was self-taught as an artist, the odds were not in her favor as a woman artist who wanted to claim that role.
But she had a predecessor. She had, like Hanna Ryggen belonged to the generation before her, and I think she was quite important. But how did she get away with it? No, I don't know. But I think she did it because she had this bravery. She had this like, okay, I can do it, and I will do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Did she support herself largely through these public commissions? Like, were they consistent enough and rewarding enough that
I think so
she could, in terms of the work for galleries, I know she wasn't showing in galleries, but the works which were autonomous works like this, she could do whatever she wanted because she didn't depend on selling them.
Economically?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know for sure, but I think she did so many commissions that it must have helped her economically. Yeah.
She also had private collectors.
Yeah.
So at one point in the 60s, the American ambassador to Norway was a collector of Anker Aurdals. And there was sort of an elite clientele of also corporate collectors as well. I came across a newspaper article where it's front page news that she's going to make tapestries for a cruise ship as well. So, I mean, it was she had different outlets for her work.
But she has status. I guess it's the question. She has status because of the public commissions, which make, therefore, for a high-end collector who's perhaps seeing the work as commensurate, like that could lead to a certain kind of collecting. Someone who's like an ambassador is already in this has a high public profile. Yeah, there's some kind of fit. Because what I'm struck with, none of the weavers of her generation in the US, of course, there's no public commissions. There's no work for the state. No. And the only one who got any commissions that I'm aware of in the 50s and 60s was Annie Albers, who is making works for the synagogue, for several synagogues. And these were the screen of the Torah. And so like the one with gold and the calligraphy, she made maybe 4 commissions, which are multi-partite scroll-like forms. But certainly not enough to have supported her in any way. Yeah. So what those in the Americas are under pressure to do, if they have to support themselves, is to develop a language which is identifiable in the same way that as an artist who's, for the most part, depending on sales in galleries, develops a signature style that kind of carries through and evolves. And this remarkable kind of variety and coexistence of different styles is not conducive to having a career through sales. And I think that, obviously, I don't want to make an argument that all of this is generated by finance and logistics, but it must play into, to some extent, into the structure of the practice that American artists based in the Americas who made work that looked like their work once they got established and grew out of their work, rather than out of this formal stylistic expression, a variety that she was motivated to explore.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a very good point. But we also here in Norway have this working grants for artists, which also, of course, helps out. But I think the case of Hanna Ryggen, who she kind of revitalized the Norwegian monumental painting tradition. And Hanna Ryggen did so with her very political tapestries, and Synnøve Anker Aurdal used them in a different kind of way, maybe also to, like, especially in some of them, emphasize the beauty of creation, and also to underscore humanity's more humble place in relation to nature's time and space. And she especially does that in the first public commission, the High Throne, and also in the last one I write about the space and the words.
Yeah, she had an early hit, as they would say in music, with the Throne Tapestry, which is from around 1960, isn't it?
1958.
It's done in 61, isn't it? Oh, well. Okay, well, yeah, we'll slot that out later. But around that time, but obviously the Håkonshallen in Bergen is a site of national significance, so that also gave her sort of her work sort of projection. And I think you're absolutely right that apart from being a magpie, as Marit puts it, Anker Aurdal was also a mixer. She was a great mixer with sort of, between figurative elements and non-representational elements, abstract elements.
Yeah, she used. I mean, it's easier to abstract nature than history in a way, but she smuggled in the history with words and with different kind of quotes from poems, from different kind of literature, which is also a very interesting trait, I think.
Yep, Lynne. Just, the woven history is still on tour. So those of us who haven't seen it yet, we will have the chance. Well, we have the chance if we go to Canada, to Ottawa, where it's being shown at the moment. And next year, from April to September, it'll be shown at MoMA. Now, just before we started this talk, you mentioned that at the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa, there are only few textiles in their collection, or there are few examples of art weaving in their collection. This would be unlike MoMA, I assume. I mean, they have weaving, and they've done at an early point as well. They've done exhibitions, so big survey shows in the 60s and 70s on textile art and textile craft. But I was wondering, woven histories is also an intervention or corrective into modern art history and how modern art has been collected and shown institutionally, I guess. Apropos of what you said of Line Ortoni and Agnes Martin and the firewall between them, as you put it.
Yes, as you say, Lars, the Museum of Modern Art was formed in 1928, but by the 30s it was collecting textiles. But there were departments like film, there was architecture and design, textiles, painting and sculpture and so forth. And it was a modernist vision that would include the Bauhaus as important along, and the work made in the early years of the Soviet Union, and as well as a kind of much more hermetic painting for painting's sake that was going on, say, in Paris. That view of modernism died by the Second World War, and what emerged in the US and many other places was a very rigid focus on painting and sculpture and the pushing to the margins of many other art forms, or at least not showing them in dialogue. And MoMA stewarded that high modernist theory for decades, and many other institutions, and the whole art world was structured around the preeminence of painting and sculpture and the innovations in painting and sculpture and so forth. And that didn't kind of start to fall apart, I suppose, until the 70s a little bit, with new mediums like photography and performance being added and given importance as ways, particularly for queer artists and women artists and artists of color who wanted to challenge the kind of masculinist marking of abstract painting. But in terms of a real kind of even playing field, I don't think it happens to the extent it's happened at all until the 21st century.
Yeah. To go over that terrain again from a different angle. And this is a big question, and I can feel a wormhole opening up. But freedom. I mean, freedom was connected to abstraction in painting in a major way during the cultural Cold War. That would be, abstraction conceived as an art for the free world. Unlike, socialist realism and other kinds of figuration. And it would include, for instance, Jackson Pollock's abstract expressionism with its painterly masculinity and transcendent goals. MoMA also had a finger in that game as well. But I wonder how this modern mythology of artistic freedom, How can you say something about how you see that being sort of how it plays out in weaving, or how it's negotiated in weaving?
That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a
Really, really good question.
Yes,
I doubt that any of the women I've mentioned really would have articulated a play for freedom in quite these terms. I mean, you could say that it's the CIA and all the US embassies that kind of frame abstract expressionism within these terms. Pollock and Rothko are talking about, or Newman and Rothko in particular, talking about transcendence, and but we might see it as politicized because of the way that critics and the State Department got behind it. But I don't think. I mean, I don't think the politics as was really part of the driving ideas for the abstract expressionists, let alone for others. And it was social change that the Albers, both Joseph and Annie Albers, the Bauhaus, they wanted to change the world. It was a materialist vision of social change in large part. If you change the stuff you live with and you make better stuff and everybody can have it, then the world will start to change. So I'm not answering your question very well.
No, I think you are.
But I think when Albers is working, Annie Albers is working on the post-war world, she's thinking about, and for her, Corbusier's idea of a weaving being the epitome of what modern art needs to be, because she says we live in this fast-paced world and we're nomadic, not in the sense we might think of that now, but changing jobs, moving countries, blah, 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 and you just roll up your painting-adjacent textile. Yes, and so making those, I suppose, could be seen as connected to an idea of freedom, but it's also an idea of what modern architecture requires to make it livable.
Yeah.
In terms you were talking about it.
But how would you say, I mean, about the question about scale? Because I think that's quite interesting in the Norwegian art history, that the women suddenly were allowed to work in big formats. How was that in the US?
Well, by then, modern art was big.
Yeah.
If you think of Pollock and Rothko. But the
tapestries.
The Biennale of Lausanne has a requirement. The tapestries have to be big. Like you couldn't send a small work in. And that was remarkable. It's part of the way it's founded in the 40s by Lusa and others. And it's about status. It's about recalling the great traditions of tapestry in the 17th century and the 15th century. So anyone who's not working on it's 12 feet or something, it's you can't submit works for consideration. So by definition, everything started to scale up. Yeah. And for modernist architecture, corporate headquarters, office, whatever, that's the kind of scale that works too, I think.